Which components are appropriate to fund through reserves? Should the parking lot be in there? What about the landscaping? What about something with a long life like an elevator? The good news is that there's a simple 3-part test that identifies which projects should and should not appear in your reserve plan. To see this test in action, in this portion of our Reserve Studies 101 webinar, we'll take you on a virtual tour of a few associations. We'll show you examples how this 3-part test is applied to many different types of reserve projects. By the end, you'll learn why some projects should be funded through your reserve budget and why others are left out. Having all the appropriate projects appear in your component list helps you minimize unwanted surprises, like special assessments, because you'll be financially prepared. All right, so now we change gears to talk about component selection, how we decide which component projects are appropriate for reserve funding. So I'll hand over the microphone to our guest expert here, Christian. All yours.
Awesome, Robert. Thank you. And this is a reminder here. This is ongoing curriculum. We started last month with Reserve Study Basics. And this week we're talking about the physical analysis and Reserve Studies 101 and the component list. And then in March, we'll move on to the financial portion, the financial analysis with Reserve Studies 102 and talking about reserve fund strength, percentage funded. And then in May, we will talk about funding plans and moving forward once you know your position. Awesome. So quickly, all the curriculum that we have here is based on National Reserve Study standards. First National Reserve Study standards were put in place back in 1998 and really served us well for a long time. And in 2021, unfortunately, we were hit with the Champlain Towers tragedy, and that gave us an opportunity to really revisit what was working with National Reserve Study standards and what wasn't working and how we could move forward. And that really brings us to 2023, where we have the new 3-part test. And we'll dive into that in further detail as we move along here. And really, this is the foundation, again, as we've said, for the physical analysis. First off, we want to take a look at who is responsible. Is this an association obligation? And where do we first look for that? We look to the community declarations to see how the community is legally defined, how it's legally structured. Perhaps you guys are familiar with communities that have different elements of ownership, like cities or counties, perhaps with easements, waterways, piping, so on and so forth. We want to look to the declarations to see how the community is defined in common area. Second, what is reasonably anticipated? Does this project have some evidence for how we can set up the frequency structure? Is this project going to come due in 5 years? Well, how do we know that? Is there reliable standards from vendors, history, so on and so forth? Can we reasonably predict the project? And also, is it a significant cost? Typically for an association, you're looking at about 0.5% to 1% of the annual budget would be appropriate for a reserve funding level. Something below that would likely fit into the operating budget or could easily be absorbed into the operating budget if not foreseen. Robert, can we talk a second about signature authority?
Signature authority is what we call it when the board or manager has authority to spend money. And so if it's something that they can just spend money on because it needs to be done, that's typically an indication that it is below a level of significance for reserve funding.
Brilliant. Again, to reiterate, taking a look at the declarations to see where something like signature authority is discussed for the board and manager. As we're looking at diving into the appropriateness of certain components and the inclusion of them in the reserve study, it's important to realize that one size does not fit all. Communities vary in size and complexity, so it's really easy to get caught up in perhaps thinking that there is a master list that you could use. And what we found over the years that whenever there is a checklist that's being used, vital details really get skipped over. So we want to make sure that we're using our eyes and our ears and all of our senses to see what's actually at the community rather than looking at a checklist and trying to go at it that way. And really kind of the guide there comes back to the National Reserve Study standards and the 3-part test that really works well in nearly every situation, whether we're talking about wood frame townhomes, perhaps a steel and concrete high-rise that has complex mechanicals and pressure systems, older communities with stucco and wood that likely haven't been painted in a long time, maybe some moisture penetration issues, resort communities that have vast amenity areas with pools and golf courses and restaurants, or something like this that has major deterioration. Again, we're looking to the National Reserve Study standards to guide us as to what's appropriate for inclusion in the reserve study. And this looks like a great example of something you'd see up in northern Washington out in the fields there, an old barn that simply hasn't been touched. Again, this is about risk planning. This is about seeing what's in front of us that's inevitable and predictable. A lot of things aren't predictable, but we want to make sure that those things that are have a great plan as we move forward in time. So with that, let's take a look at the National Reserve Study standards and kind of put them to the test in a couple of different scenarios and see how they meet these real-world examples. We'll start off with some simple ones. Here we have a community where the association has deemed that the HVAC systems are owner responsibility. Now, even though they sit on potentially a common area for this community, this is a pretty easy one, right? It's a tee-up. Simply looking at the declaration shows that these are owner responsibility. And then the situation here, you have a on-site manager's office. And in this particular scenario, the computing systems, furniture, perhaps they have a copier in there. Those are all owned by the management company. So even though they serve a common purpose and they're there for the community and they keep the community moving forward, the ultimate maintenance, repair, and replacement of those elements would be considered responsibility of the management company. Let's say we move into a situation where there's a subterranean garage here. This is certainly a common area, but a little bit more of a nuance here is the replacement of structural concrete. Typically with concrete components, you wouldn't be looking at necessarily a total replacement of the entire concrete area of the garage. Rather, you'd be looking at some normal repair and replacement elements that come up as major cracks form or perhaps some waterproofing issues. So we wouldn't set aside funding for a total replacement because that's not really a predictable project. With an exception of saying if there was perhaps a structural report that had come out from an engineer that is recommending a large-scale reconstruction effort, then that's when we would start to take a look at that as a reserve project. And say we're in that same garage here and we're taking a look over at the sump pump system. Now, the board may not know that this is even there. That's a very common occurrence, but the engineer on site has seen this before. Replacement hasn't occurred in a long time. However, we know that typically these last around 10 to 15 years. The community knows that it's working normally now, but since it is getting to that kind of maybe 10 plus year level, replacement would be considered something that should be anticipated in the near future, especially if the engineer is saying, we really don't know the age of that unit. It is a substantial cost, so this is a great representation of a good common area component to include. And if we go up to the roof area here, likely the same building, we see this hallway ventilator system, a very simple system here, motor, belt, those types of small cost items that would be a part of repair elements. And this one would be a great example of simply just being able to absorb into the operating fund. Belts and motors, those are generally low cost, especially for a building like this. So that typically wouldn't meet the 0.5% to a 1% of annual budget type of level. Now we maybe move into some more complex scenarios here. We have another subterranean garage type of atmosphere where we have some common plumbing systems. The community has identified that there is a leak issue, obviously, as they have put up some sheet metal gutters here to prevent water from dripping onto the vehicles below. You can also see some staining on the ceiling there, noting that there has been some efflorescence around. So this is an interesting one, right, where we have common piping in a subterranean garage. Obviously, this is a common area. Certainly, when we're talking about repiping, especially in garage areas like this, that would be a substantial cost and absolutely predictable on timeline as it is naturally failing right now in front of our eyes. So this is a great idea of how we can easily put this into reserves. Hopefully they have a plumbing assessment or a structural engineer assessment to let us know what is needed there. And this is an interesting one too, where we get to look at the history of projects to guide us as we put this into the component list. This is a hillside here, probably one of 10 or 15 or many more than that at this community. And we see some areas here where they've tried to shore up from some landslides. And now we might not predict that all of the slopes in the community are going to fail at once, but this particular community has some history here where approximately every 5 years or so, they get something like this that costs about maybe $50,000 or so. So even though we don't think that all the hillsides are going to fail at once, we do have that history of projects that gives us kind of an average to go on, right? Every 5 years, we'll set aside $50,000 or so to cover those hillside projects that could require $50,000 or even more. And so this last one here is a good representation of a capital improvement and why that's not appropriate for reserves. In this particular scenario, this pickleball court didn't exist at a certain point. This was just common area that existed between a home and the perimeter fencing. But the community decided that they wanted to do some improvement. And so they put in this pickleball court. Now, the installation would not qualify as a reserve component because it didn't exist there before, right? The community hadn't been setting aside funds to basically factor for that resurfacing or net replacement or so on and so forth. It just simply didn't exist yet. So that would be considered a capital improvement rather than a reserve component. Now, once that is built and in place, the community can start reserving for projects like striping, perhaps regrading at the long periods of 20 to 30 years, landscaping around the area, maybe the gazebo replacement, something like that. So those are some really good, simple examples of how National Reserve Study standards really filter out, indeterminate projects, long life components that are expected to be there for the life of the building or the project itself. Small cost components, we can totally eliminate those. Capital improvements, we see how those aren't appropriate. And really what this boils down to in the end is, on average, we see around the country that there are about 35 to 50 components total for simple condominiums and townhomes. And I'll obviously take that with the greatest salt because we know that there are more complex communities out there that could have hundreds of components, or simple communities that could have maybe only a dozen or so. And with that, we really want to take a dive into what details are going to go into our reserve study when we have components that are included. So we have a good basis for how we determine what goes into the study. Now, what is appropriate to include about those components? And so first off, we want to get a good description of a component, right? We got to know what we're looking at, whether it's a pool, asphalt, so on and so forth. And then the second one here, we want to identify all the important things about it, right? If it's asphalt, how much asphalt are we looking at in terms of gross square footage? If it's a mechanical component, perhaps we'll put in some details about the BTU ratings, something that gives us as much information as we can absorb about that particular project or asset. And then, of course, we want to have the overall service life, how often that's expected to be completed, and then the due date, the remaining useful life, when that project is coming up next for completion. And then overall, of course, we want to have the current replacement cost. So some basic information that should be present in all of your reserve components. Next, we'll take a look at, this is an excerpt from our executive summary here, and you'll see how that looks in the actual reserve study itself. Now in this one, keep in mind, we've eliminated the detail element of it where we're looking at quantities or sizes or counts of things, and that's just simply to save space within the executive summary. But here you'll see as we move from left to right, we have a description of the component itself in pool furniture, pool, roof, asphalt, and then it goes into a little bit more detail about whether we're replacing pool furniture, we're resurfacing the pool, sealing of the asphalt as compared to resurfacing. So giving you a good description of what that project means. And then as you move right, you'll see the overall service life or the useful life. And then when the project is coming due next, the remaining life, and then the cost of the project as well. And the pool furniture gives us a good example here of the relativity of how this differs from association to association. You could have, for I think this example, it seems like this is a pretty mid-size association, maybe 30 to 50 units, and they have just a simple amount of pool furniture, not a whole ton. But that can expand into, sometimes you see hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of pool furniture when you're talking about resort-style entities. So keep in mind, it is all relative from association to association. And as you extrapolate that component list out into one of our charts here that simply shows the annual reserve expenses, you'll see what that looks like in a graphical form. So this is a 30-year looking report for those simple components. And you'll see where those major costs start to hit, right? Those are going to be your roofing projects, your asphalt projects. Those are where the major costs are going to come in. And it's important to remember that, we simply don't have a crystal ball. We would love to have that. But as you are moving forward in time and you're completing more and more reserve studies, our hope is that the precision gets better and better and better, and that we are able to, as projects come closer, have more and more refined details so that that precision can be utilized really well. And so when we start talking about the importance of these major projects, right, we look back at that annual reserve expense chart here, we see in those big years, 14 years out, 25 years out, those are very impactful projects. And so what we want to talk about next is how the impact is determined and why that is important for each community.
At Association Reserves, we make the present less stressful and the future more secure. If you want to join us in this mission, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. Leave a comment down below on what you'd like to see us address in a future video. Let's plan for your best future.